Wednesday night class for this week. We're continuing and getting pretty close to concluding our study on the life of Joseph from the book of Genesis. Jim Morgan, Aaron Tremblay here with the Smyrna Church of Christ. We're picking up this week in chapter 48, and we get to see the blessing, the passing of the blessing from Jacob to his sons. So that's really what we're going to be dealing with for the next couple of weeks in chapter 48 and 49. Let me continue to encourage you, if you have any questions of any kind or on our text today, or any ideas for the future for classes maybe you'd like to have, feel free to email us at the email provided in the link, and we'll be happy to address those questions and maybe even take on your topic as our class, our next class after we finish the life of Joseph. So, I want to jump right in here to 48:1.
Let's go.
It says, after this, Joseph was told, behold, your father is ill. One thing maybe to point out here right at the beginning of chapter 48 is we're not given a specific amount of time that passes.
No, just the NIV says sometime later. Sometime
later. It's just, this is the next major event following after the conclusion of chapter 47. It says, behold, your father is ill. Now, we know from the actions that are going to come after this that this wasn't just, hey, dad's got a cold.
He's got a cold or,
something
chicken pox or something.
What the text is really going to indicate to us is that this message that Joseph gets is dad's on his deathbed. I mean, this is it. It's imminent. And we know that because the very next thing in verse 1 it says is that Joseph takes with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So Joseph knows it's very close to the end, and as is the tradition in the Old Testament, the major thing that takes place when a father is preparing to die is the blessing is passed on to each of his children will receive a blessing. And so Joseph is going to assume the first position in that blessing. It doesn't say, and Joseph went and got Reuben and told Reuben, hey, dad's going to die. But Joseph, as the first informed, is the first to respond and go there to his father's side.
And that goes back to what we were talking about before we came on the air. In this family, you've got four firstborns. Joseph is one of them. So he's certainly within his rights to go and see what his father wants to do. He knows that his family's going to end up with the majority of the blessings, so he just goes, let's get this over with. And I think you're right. They know that this is the end because in verse 2, when Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to you, Israel rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. So he's bedridden. Apparently he hadn't had the strength to sit up. And only when he finds out that Joseph comes, it says he rallies and then he sits up.
And it tells us Joseph's continued favored status too.
Oh, yes.
Because he's not just sitting up for anybody. When he finds out it's Joseph, he rallies his strength.
Yeah, you can imagine. He said, "Oh, Reuben's here, go away."
That's right. He rolls over to the other side.
Yeah.
That is an important point to make. And verse 3 says, and Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Now, Luz or Luz, however you prefer to pronounce it, is more easily pronounced Bethel, because that's what he's talking about. That God Almighty appeared to me and blessed me. And I think we spent a little bit of time on the meaning, the significance of Bethel a couple of weeks ago as kind of the last stop on the way to Egypt.
And it's possible that it's known by several different names because you've got that situation in the Bible.
Correct.
Several times. So, Bethel could be what the people who come along later refer to it as because that would be the Israelite name. But Luz is what the people of the land called it, before they came back.
So he blessed me, he said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. Now, we're having the continuation of the Jacob family tradition here in this verse that we've experienced throughout the life of Joseph, which is...
Nobody can talk straight.
No. Every time somebody says something and it's related, it's like the game of telephone, but it never even gets to the second person before it gets messed up.
Yeah.
Because God actually says to Jacob specifically when he's talking about the fruitful and multiplying, he says, be fruitful and multiply. He's telling him something that he's going to do, and Jacob makes it into something really passive. Oh, God's going to make me fruitful. God's going to make me multiply.
Not uncommon.
Not uncommon. And he does that with everything God basically says.
Mm-hmm.
The other major transition is Jacob recalls it as a company of peoples, and God said, I'll make of you a great nation.
Yeah.
Right? And
NIV
so,
actually has community of peoples.
Community of peoples.
Yeah.
And
so,
I think there's a little difference between I'll make you a great nation, my great nation, you'll be a people
mm-hmm.
of, you know, unique and set apart for me, apart from all the nations of the world, as opposed to, you know, a suburb, a community of peoples, you know. But anyway, Jacob, I just think it's interesting. He recalls that a little differently, but nonetheless, he's telling Joseph the promise that God made directly to him. Verse 5 says, and now your 2 sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine as Reuben and Simeon are. So there's kind of a mouthful said here in this verse.
No kidding. And basically, I think it goes back to the favoritism. He's going to find a way to give Joseph 2 portions of land instead of just 1.
Yeah, and on top of that, you know, I'm not a grandfather, but as a grandfather, you know, hey, these 2 grandchildren I never even got to meet, they were born to you before I got
mm-hmm.
I got to make up for some lost time. They're going to be children just like my children are to me. You know, you can imagine not meeting your grandchildren until they're grown, you know,
no, I can't.
and losing that precious time with them. And so I do think it's interesting that Jacob mentions the fact that these were your children before I even got to Egypt, before I even knew you're alive, before I got to meet them. They were your children, but here's how I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to make them mine to make up for that loss. Is kind of how I read that. Why else would he mention that huge disparity of time between when they were born and when he meets them? And let's notice in the second half of the verse, Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine as Reuben and Simeon are. So we know what makes Reuben and Simeon significant is we're talking about firstborn and secondborn. So not only is Jacob saying they will be in addition to my sons, but they will become to me like my firstborn mm-hmm. from Leah and my secondborn Simeon. Mm-hmm. And
firstborn from Rachel.
Right. So we can talk about this a little bit more maybe later on, but there's a reason why Reuben and Simeon are essentially skipped over for Judah in the next chapter, and essentially skipped over here and replaced with Ephraim and Manasseh, or at least
that's
lowered to the position of Ephraim and Manasseh. Yeah. And the children you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance.
If I could, the NIV I think is a little bit clearer on that one.
Okay.
It says, any children born to you after them will be yours. In the territory they inherit, they'll be reckoned under the names of their brothers. So, you know, it's not like we're going to have a 4-fold division or however. I don't know if Joseph even has any more children. I don't think so.
I don't think it's made
clear. But, you know, he says that if there are, the blessing's going to be on these 2, not the ones to follow.
Right. They'll be covered under this blessing, under these names.
When they go in and inherit, it'll be because they're of Manasseh and Ephraim, not because they're Frank and Smith.
Right.
So
keeping it. Now he's trying to be equitable.
Yeah.
So that's significant. He's including even potential future heirs, since God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." Verse 7: As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So you had kind of had something you wanted to mention about that.
Well, this verse makes no sense whatsoever. He's talking about Manasseh and Ephraim, and he's talking about, you know, the children that are born. Did I mention that, you know, on the way down to when we were going to Ephrath that Rachel died? It's almost like, he's reached the end of his life, and there seems to be some dementia setting in here, some forgetfulness. Mm-hmm. He's lost track of a conversation. He sees Joseph, he remembers Rachel, and his mind wanders back to it. And so I think that, you know, there's no context here. That this in no way is connected to what he's been talking about. But you do have to remember his age, his condition. He's rallied. At the end of your life, as I understand it, you really start looking back. I remember my dad. There were days when he was back running the hills of Reedville, Tennessee. And he was just really happy because he was back there in the past, and it was when everything was good. and we didn't disturb him. You know, we didn't say, now Daddy, wake up, you know you're not, you go back to where the happy days were.
Sure.
And I think that may be what's happened to Jacob here. Maybe that's the reason I look at this and see is because I've been through this experience. But it indicates that there's some failure of his mind here, that this is not a man who is as sharp as when he took his father-in-law for everything he had.
I think your point that he's going back to the happiest place is true, because he's going back to Rachel.
Yeah.
And that's where his heart really always was. And that's actually where Joseph's favoritism comes from, is via Rachel.
Yeah.
It's the first son that Rachel gave to Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where his favoritism ultimately comes from. I'm just reading this now, I'm just noticing in the land of Canaan, she died in the land of Canaan. She never got to make it to Egypt. And you remember Jacob said, make sure you bring me back to Canaan. Don't leave me here in Egypt. You take me back to where I belong. And maybe part of the reason that was important to him was to get back to
Be
where
buried
Rachel
with
is.
his people.
Right.
I think that is a real good point.
But we know his heart's always belonged to Rachel throughout the story.
Yeah, he
Jacob
had no intention of marrying Leah. That was Laban fooled him into that. After that, it was done. There was nothing else he could do. Laban gets an extra 7 years out of it.
Yeah, he gets some extra work.
Yeah, but I think his mind has now gone back to the past. That's where he is, and that's also the reason that when he's going to bless the other sons, he very much remembers what they did.
Oh yeah, especially
Because right now
Simeon
he's
and
spending
Levi.
a lot of time in the past,
Mhm.
and with Rachel, it's the good memories, but you also remember the people who messed with you. When David is dying, all of these years he's not taken revenge on anybody, and he tells Solomon, a wise man like you will know what to do. So, I think he's closing out his life here. There's some good things that he's looking back on. Joseph is going to be the reminder of those. When he sees the rest of his sons, he's going to remember what they did too.
And he's being sure here to secure, you talk about, looking back at the past, he's being sure to secure the future for his favorite son and his descendants and those kind of things. Because Joseph had always been the one that did right in the past for Jacob. And so even before he deals with Reuben or any of the rest of them, he wants to make sure he gets it right for Joseph, and Joseph gets adequate blessing before he gets to the other sons.
Yeah, he missed so much of Joseph's life, he wants to make sure that he's going to do what he can to compensate for it.
Verse 8, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? And Joseph said to his father, they are my sons whom God has given me here. So much emphasis in this whole passage on where Ephraim and Manasseh were born. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. Kind of a genetic history of eye problems at the end of life in the patriarchal family.
Yeah, Isaac had that the same problem, which is the whole reason why the Jacob and Esau thing worked.
Exactly.
Was able to go over. But I think it's interesting that at this point, he doesn't even know that the sons are there because he can't see them.
You can't see that
Again,
far.
his old age, he's falling apart.
And maybe
things are just shutting down.
Maybe he learned from his own life experience that you ask before you do the blessing, just to be sure.
Just to make sure. Good point.
So he says, bring them to me, please, I may bless them. His eyes were dim so that he could not see. Joseph brought them near, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also. We have to remember that for Jacob, from the time that he loses, that report first comes back and he loses Joseph, he gets glimpses of hope somewhat when his sons come home and tell him, hey, Dad, Joseph's alive and all that. But we got to remember, Joseph didn't say, oh, boy, you told me he's alive. I believe it. Let's go. I mean, it took some convincing for Jacob to believe he would actually see Joseph again.
Actually, it took until they got down in Egypt and he actually saw him for himself.
That's right. And on top of that, for Jacob to find out that his favorite son had sons and to be able to meet them, I mean, Jacob is just overwhelmed at what he thought would never be possible.
And immediately they become his favorites.
That's right. They become his favorite even though he had a whole ton of other grandchildren.
And that's one thing that you mentioned last time about Benjamin.
Yes.
We think of Benjamin as being the little kid. Benjamin had a lot of kids.
Oh, 10.
But you'll notice they're not getting the blessing here.
That's right. That's right. And that's helpful to us because a lot of times we think of Joseph as a boy, even though he grows into his manhood way before his father gets there. And we think of Benjamin when Benjamin gets brought to Egypt as, this little boy who kind of
charms everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
a playful little boy, but he's got 10 children.
Kids.
So he's no little boy.
Yeah, but none of them get this special blessing.
That's right. And
it's Joseph. It's always been Joseph. It'll always be Joseph.
As soon as Joseph's in the picture, he immediately returns to his favorite status, and his children also. Then Joseph removed them from his knees and bowed himself with his face to the earth. So he prostrates himself. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. So the text is being very careful here to make sure we understand where everybody's position is. It doesn't just say on his left. Well, whose left? Is it Joseph's left or Jacob?
Yeah.
No. It says Ephraim is in Joseph's right hand going to the left of Jacob, and Manasseh is at Joseph's left hand going to the right of Jacob. The reason being that the right hand is the favored position, and that's where the firstborn should be for both these children to be
When
blessed.
it says that Jesus is at the right hand of God, that's not just geographical position.
Correct.
That is a position
Of significance. Yeah. And so these two sons, Joseph is doing everything in his power to make sure this doesn't get screwed up.
Well, because this is the way it's supposed to work.
Correct. And Jacob, to be fair to him, is trying to make sure he's blessing the right people. Who are these? Who are these other people? Oh, okay, that's Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah, they're a little fuzzy. Bring them in.
Yeah, and Joseph puts everything, so you would have to try to screw this up. That's the point the text is making. Everything is in the right position. And Jacob does. He finds a way. So Joseph is there. He's positioned his sons. Jacob reaches his arms out to extend the blessing. I'm in verse 14. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So this is extremely intentional on Jacob's part. There's no way that Jacob doesn't know what's happening. He crosses his arms. That's not a natural motion for you to do.
No.
And it's just so interesting to me that that's what happens, because Jacob's father, it was a joke. Jacob's father was manipulated to make a mistake and give a blessing in the wrong way to the wrong son. He had bad eyesight, and Isaac could have blamed it on that. I couldn't really see. I didn't know what I was doing. I took his word for it. He manipulated me. Jacob here gives the blessing the wrong way, but there's no one to blame for it except for himself.
Yeah.
And so I think that's pretty significant. Now we have to look at the fact too that going back generation upon generation, the blessing really hasn't gone to the firstborn anyway.
It has been a long time.
It's been a hop, skip, and a jump, seems like, is what the blessing does.
Okay, you start with Abraham.
You start with Abraham, and you could start with even with Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
And Abel doesn't exactly get the blessing. But Seth ends up being the one who the blessing kind of ends up carrying through. But yeah, Abraham has his firstborn is Ishmael with Hagar. And not only does Ishmael not receive the actual promise tied to the blessing that God gives, but he's sent away completely from Abraham's household because Sarah doesn't want to be around Hagar.
Her son will not hang around with my son.
That's right.
And that's exactly the way she puts it, my son.
So the blessing jumps not to the firstborn, but to the secondborn, which is Isaac. And then Isaac, his blessing should have gone to Esau as the firstborn of the twins, but it jumps over Esau because of Jacob's manipulation, and it goes to Jacob. And God honors it in that case, in both cases. He honors the blessing and blesses Jacob. And then Jacob begins, rather than beginning with Reuben, he begins with Joseph, which is his favorite son. And not only that, but he adds 2 additional sons into the receiving of Joseph's blessing. So Joseph's forever descendants are going to get more than any other tribe of Jacob. Even after all of the conquering of the promised land in Joshua, when the land's allocated out, Ephraim gets an allocation, Manasseh gets an allocation. But all the rest of the tribes are restricted to 1.
And at the end, they're all in the northern tribes and they go away.
Correct. Judah's really
with
the
all of
only
the
one.
manipulation and all of the trying to make sure this group's going to be blessed, it doesn't work out. God gets what He wants.
That's right. And so I think that's kind of what's going on here. Jacob crosses his arms. He's messing up the blessing. Maybe part of what he's trying to do is legitimize, hey, it worked for me and God honored it. Let me just, maybe he feels like he won't be the only one.
Of course, down in 19, when Joseph, tries to straighten it out, he says, I know. This is the way it's going to be.
And his justification is, oh, don't worry, they're both going to be blessed.
Yeah.
Right? And I can almost hear Jacob saying that to justify to Rebekah when he's deceiving Isaac. Well, yeah, Esau will still get a blessing.
Yeah, it's okay.
That's fine. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
So anyway, so this is significant.
And again, we were talking about it beforehand, but there's no indication this is the will of God.
Correct.
There's nothing here except the cussedness of Jacob, that he is determined, and we don't know why. What was it that made one grandchild more special than the other? We don't know. But Jacob saw something, and he was determined, this is the way it's going to be. Yeah, the other kid's going to be great too, but this is the one that I'm going to bless. Once you get into the habit of favoritism, it's a very hard habit to get out of.
And I think God honors it too. Like, you look at the situation with Jacob and Esau. Why didn't God just strike Jacob dead and let Esau get the blessing anyway? Or why doesn't God allow it to be fixed and tell Isaac, well, just give it again. It doesn't count because you gave it to the wrong person.
Yeah.
But God honors the blessing. God honors the promise that's made, the word that's given, and carries on that promise in spite of the flawed things that humans try and do to interfere with the process.
Yeah.
He still honors the blessing and the promise. And so in
we're
that
still
way,
doing it.
right. And so in that way, I think that's just God being God.
Yeah.
Jacob says, oh, watch this. And God's like, okay, well, it's still going to come through Judah like I planned.
It doesn't matter. It's that one over there. But there's a long line of people and situations in the Bible where somebody makes a dumb promise. But if you, the assumption is that if you take it in the name of God, then it has to be that way. Now, there's times that we know, like one of the judges promises, that he's going to sacrifice the first thing that comes out, and it's his daughter, and he does. God doesn't demand human sacrifice. That's against it. But he feels like, well, if I promised in God's name, then I have to do this. And so, it's all the way through. People don't see that, it is possible for you to do something dumb, and God doesn't demand anything but repentance.
It's a good point. And Jesus deals with it in the New Testament. Don't make those vows. Just let your yes be yes, because it had become such a thing that unless you said, in God's name, I'll pay you back the money I owe you.
If you swear by the gold of the temple, that's no good.
That
but
doesn't
if you
count.
swear by the temple, gates, okay, that.
If I got my toes crossed, it doesn't count.
That's
it's
it.
Only if I say. So that's where Jesus is trying to break all that up and say, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Just let your word be given. But God, all throughout the Old Testament, all from the beginning of creation, truly, because God's plan, his design, I don't think, his intention wasn't for man to fall. That's not why he made the garden.
No.
But man does fall, but God develops a plan. God works with that and creates or develops this plan of salvation for mankind. And so all throughout the Bible, people are trying so hard to screw up what God's trying to do, including Judas, including others who think that they're going to, Satan himself, thinking that he's unraveling God's plan or preventing what God wants to happen. And God works in spite of mankind's mistakes, in spite of Satan's attacks, in spite of all of those things. God brings his will to pass.
Well, the issue with all sin is, I know better than God. You look at Adam and Eve. Did God really tell you that, Satan? Did God really tell you that? He knows. And he says, well, watch this. And she said, I'll do this because this is what's better. Cain and Abel. You get outside the garden, same thing continues. I think God ought to be willing to accept this in worship. And boy, that one's continued for a long, long time.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And same here. And I just see that God's faithfulness has been, the story of Jacob's life is God's faithfulness is still there, even if you're Jacob.
Even that's a good way to put it. Even
so,
if you're Jacob.
And God's faithfulness is still there, even if you're Joseph. Even if everything seems like it's falling apart around you, keep your trust in God. He'll be faithful through it all. And that's true for Joseph being a righteous man. And the only reason that it seems to me that Jacob is even still alive and hasn't died at the hands of Esau is because God's being faithful to that
Mhm.
blessing that was given to him by his father that he's now talking to Joseph about. So here's Jacob crosses his arms. It doesn't really matter. Theologically, I think there's maybe some significance here, and that's what I feel like God does with us. We receive a blessing that we have no business at all receiving.
Mhm.
And Jesus gets what we should have gotten, which is death for sin, and not just death, but death on a cross and the shame and everything that goes with sin. God crossed his hands. He put all of that on Jesus, and he puts the blessing on us, but only because Jesus was there are we even able to do that.
Yeah.
And so,
And theologically, for the people, again, going back to the people that Moses is actually talking to 400 and something years later going into the land, it's going to be important to figure this whole mess out, to figure out who gets what inheritance, because the firstborn is going to get more.
yeah.
Well, Reuben, hey, right here. No, don't you remember back during the story of Joseph? And so this whole thing should have been so simple. Firstborn, that's it. But as with everything else, people have found a way to mess it up. So we have to go through all of this so that 400 years in the future, we'll be able to figure out who's supposed to get what. And even then, there's going to be complaining going on.
Yeah, and it's like people say today, do you really have to write it down? People know what you want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah, you got to write it down. It's so important. Do you want to pick up in 15?
Okay. And then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly upon the earth." So, pretty good blessing there.
The interesting thing to me in 15 is he blessed Joseph, but the whole blessing is actually
Mhm.
directed at the grandkids,
Yeah.
right? Because eventually he'll get to Joseph here in a minute. But I find it interesting, and maybe this is helpful for you as a grandfather. It's biblical to put blessing on your grandchildren even before your own children.
Oh,
Once there's
absolutely.
grandchildren in the
Well,
picture, it's okay.
most children would have it that way.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Well, and that's
you'll
what I'm
understand
saying.
that someday.
That's what I'm saying. In 15, it's a blessing to Joseph that
Yeah.
he does that, right?
It is.
So I think that's
It is.
significant.
And the other significant part is that these kids are half Egyptian.
Mhm.
And yet he's still going to give them the blessing, and that blessing is going to continue. But the idea of half Egyptian kids getting this kind of a blessing for the purebred Israelites,
Mhm.
well, there never has been and never will be such a thing as a purebred Israelite.
Mhm.
And so the fact is that no matter where people come from, God can bless them.
That's right. They're the way the New Testament would talk about is kind of grafted in, right, into the family of God. That's a fantastic point. Just for a reminder, just that
There's no Jew, no
These are-
Gentile, no slave, no free.
these are Egyptian children that are being put in the place of Reuben and Simeon,
Mhm.
Ephraim and Manasseh. So you're right. I mean, that's a lot of magnitude to this blessing that's being given. And notice what it says, that they're going to carry on the name, let them carry on in my name and the name of my fathers. In other words, all the significance, when you think about, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, is
Mhm.
also now the God of Ephraim and the God of Manasseh, right?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that at the very beginning of chapter 48, Joseph told your fathers ill, Jacob, verse 3, Jacob, on down, Jacob, when the blessing starts, it's Israel saw, Israel said, Israel's eyes, Israel said, Israel's knees,
Mm-hmm.
Israel's right hand, Israel reached out his right hand, there's your name.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's going on there. My name, it's not Jacob. It's the name that God gave me that is going to be the name of a great nation. It is Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting the way that the text is put together there, because they stop. They don't want any dealing with Jacob. This is the Israel promise.
Another thing that just came to my head, but in God's family, He's willing to take in Ephraim and Manasseh, children who are not, as you said, if there is no such thing, pure from the line of Jacob at least.
Mm-hmm.
But when things are reversed and Egypt enslaves all of Jacob's descendants, It doesn't say except for Ephraim and Manasseh, because they were willing, because God doesn't look at them as half of anything. They become fully grafted in. They're fully a part of God's family.
Mm-hmm.
But when the role is reversed and Egypt looks at them, they look at them as half-breeds.
Yeah.
And you might as well be in there with the rest of your people, as opposed to seeing them, their Egyptian side, they see their Hebrew side, and
Mm-hmm.
they cast them into slavery alongside the rest of them. So I
But
just think that's a good point too.
Yeah, but it's just interesting that, the name.
Yeah.
And then this is the blessing, and these are the two boys.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, she's a daughter of a high priest
Yeah,
in
that's
Egypt.
right.
Yeah, that is something that we breeze by. But I can just imagine that, later in the future, there's some people, well, you came from Egyptian paganism, because people will do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not important. What's God going to do with you? That's the important part.
I have to think, although it's not mentioned in the text, based on the kind of man that Joseph was, and the kind of, a lot of people who come along the side of Jesus and start following Jesus, it's because the proof's in the pudding. The guy's raising people from the dead
Mm-hmm.
and working all these miracles. I'm going to follow this guy, right?
Yeah.
I would imagine Joseph's wife, when nobody among all the magicians and everyone else in Egypt could do something, and Joseph's like, oh, I got this, my God's got this, I can do that. And she sees that everything that Joseph says comes to pass.
Yeah.
I have to think that she's probably alongside of him. And in other words, I think
Oh,
he had greater
I know.
influence on her than she had on him.
Yeah,
Right?
and that's the point again.
Mhm.
Man, look where she comes from. She's never going to, well, look at this.
Yeah. So I think it's a great point with Joseph's family and the idea of God kind of winning in terms of influence and bringing them into the heritage of his nation.
Mm-hmm.
Alongside of all of those who were legitimate, if you will.
Which, is always going to be true. When the people are ready to come back from Babylon, they've married Babylonians.
Oh, yeah.
They're bringing them, their kids. Again, it's not the purity of your blood, it's the purity of your faith.
And Joseph's not the only one to do this. In fact, when I can't remember what the tribe was from, so Midian, when Esau finds out that it upsets his father that
Yeah.
Jacob would find a wife from somewhere else, it says, and then Esau went out, I think it's Midian,
Mhm.
went to Midian and married a Midian woman because he
Yeah.
knew it would make his dad mad because he's mad about losing his blessing.
Well, it made his dad happy.
Yeah.
That, and now he's married in the family. The two pagan girls that he was married to were a source of grief.
Right.
It says that when he saw that it was, he went and married somebody that they approved of.
Yeah.
So Esau, by the way, turns out to be a much better man than Jacob, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So anyway, down to verse 17. When Joseph, I love this. When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he's displeased. So he took hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to him, no, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. Again, he's talking to Jacob like Jacob has some dimension going on here.
Yeah.
No, Daddy, it's this one.
Well, like you said, he couldn't even recognize him in it.
Yeah.
So maybe Joseph thinks that Jacob doesn't know what he's doing, so he's
Yeah.
trying to help it and fix it.
It says he's displeased, and I can imagine. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. And he blessed them that day and said, in your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And so he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. After all of that, Ephraim and Manasseh don't remain faithful.
Mm-hmm.
The tribes don't. After all this great beginning, after all of these blessings, it doesn't matter what somebody else says, it's what you do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And Ephraim and Manasseh, there's going to be some great people. As a matter of fact, I'll get it out here in a minute. You messed me up with Jacob or whatever,
Yeah.
but Jacob.
Okay.
But Joshua
Joshua.
is
Yeah.
from the tribe of Ephraim,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think there's been too many people that God has been more pleased with than Joshua, because it says that as long as there were people alive who knew Joshua, Israel did everything they were supposed to. When Jesus comes, out of all of the names that God could have chosen, I want to name him Joshua, because that's what Jesus is. It's the Greek of the Hebrew Joshua.
Right. Yeshua.
When God names his son after you, you're a pretty good person.
Right.
But that becomes a point in Joshua, Judges, because the phrase keeps coming up, in the land of Ephraim.
Mm-hmm.
Now this was Joshua's place. And if it's that bad in Joshua's old territory, you can't imagine what it was like in the rest of it.
Yeah.
And it's Ephraim. Ephraim's supposed to be this is the wonder kid. This is the one that's going to be, everything's going to happen. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah.
It's not what somebody else has in mind for you. It's what you do to serve God.
That's right. I was just trying to think back to, in the Psalms, it talks about Ephraim being rejected in Psalm 78, starting in verse 67. It says he rejected the tent of Joseph. So he's talking about Ephraim. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he founded forever. He chose David, his servant, and took the sheepfolds from following the nursing lambs, so on and so on. So it's specifically saying he rejects Ephraim. Like you're saying, Ephraim should have been the good one. Ephraim, where that heritage of faithfulness through Joshua, but the Bible says that God rejects Ephraim and the tribes of Joseph in favor of Judah, which was necessary to ultimately fulfill his promise through the Messiah.
And it's interesting that later on, one member of the tribe of Benjamin is going to have his shot at the king. And he completely blows it. And Benjamin is replaced by Judah, Leah's kid.
Yep.
How in the world could this be? But I think it's interesting that, the favored tribes, the tribes of Benjamin, Ephraim, Manasseh, and it doesn't work out for any of them.
It's true. And it doesn't work out the way that Jacob certainly would have wanted it.
No, because if you'd asked, Jacob, which one of these, kids do you think the Messiah is going to come? Oh, he's going to come to Ephraim. No, didn't work out.
That's true.
Didn't work out. And then Israel said to Joseph, I'm about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you, as one who is over your brothers, I give the ridge of land I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. And then he calls for the rest of the sons, and I guess we'll pick up on that next week.
Yeah, and I think just as we're kind of wrapping this up, this blessing that Israel is giving ties us again. Remember, at the end of 47, it's all about don't bury me in Egypt, don't bury me in Egypt, don't bury me in Egypt. Bring me back to the burying place I'm supposed to be in with my fathers and all that stuff. We're right back to that again at the end of 48, although now instead of him talking about himself going back and being buried in the land of his fathers, now he's talking about Joseph. I'm about to die, but God be with you, and will bring you again to the land of your fathers.
Interesting in the NIV that the be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers, that's plural.
Yeah.
That is plural. So again, he can look to the time when God is going to remove these people. But you just make sure that whenever it happens, you take my bones. Joseph is going to, it's going to be 400 some odd years. Jacob's going to get his immediately. But there is a faith here. A little one. But there is a faith here that he will get to be buried with Rachel.
And on Joseph's part and the significance of this being buried in the land of the fathers, Hebrews is going to point to it later when we get towards the end of Genesis. Maybe we can look at that passage. But the significance of the fact that Joseph says, make sure you take my bones with you. And they go through 400 years of slavery, and somebody has held on to those things, because when they leave, they take them, and not only do they take them, they make sure that they bring them back to the place they're supposed to go.
Say what you want to about the people of Israel, they brought the bones.
Yeah.
And then it's specifically mentioned again in Joshua, and they took the bones and they buried them where they were supposed to. They knew exactly what they were supposed to do with them. They knew exactly where they were, and they took them with them. I
mean, imagine keeping track of anything for 400 years. Never mind while you're enslaved in a foreign nation. Yeah. And you still keep track of it.
And the king, the ruling class and everything else has changed. There's been an invasion by foreigners. Yeah. The Hyksos. I knew I could remember that eventually, but the Hyksos had come in and taken over. Egypt has this big battle, civil war after a couple of hundred years in slavery themselves, and they kicked the Hyksos out, and somebody remembers those bones.
And all through the wilderness, think about all the things that they go through in the wilderness.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of things.
And a lot of things they do, just to show God, we don't care about you anymore. Here, see these bones?
Yeah.
No. Say what you want to. There is a faithfulness there, at least when it comes to Joseph's bones.
I think it's pretty incredible. And this
Yeah.
last verse, I don't think the slope is really significant or tell us what it is. I think it's just alluding to favored status again.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, make sure you get that slope that
Yeah.
I took with my own bow, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's not really saying make sure you get it. It's make sure no one else. That's just for you, Joseph.
Yeah.
That's a little something extra.
Yeah, we're gonna you know, the kids are gonna get some more, and I got some for you too.
Yeah, exactly. So, but great text here. A lot going on. And next week we'll get into all of the other sons who don't really matter, because Joseph's the only one that really matters. But the blessing for all the other sons.
And it's incredible when you look at the blessing of Judah. I don't think Jacob really wanted to say all that.
I don't think so either.
But I think there comes a point where God makes sure some things you're going to say the right thing.
But he did. I think the one thing for Jacob, he knew there needed to be a legit blessing, a legitimate firstborn type blessing, and he was not going to give it to Reuben.
Yeah.
And he definitely wasn't going to give it to Simeon or Levi.
Yeah. But when you look at Judah, you know, the blessing here, there are prophecies of Jesus that just bust out of this thing all over the place.
Mhm.
So we'll look forward to that next week. We will see you then. Hope y'all have a great week. Stay healthy.
Take care.